the neo-Nazis of the right sector, Demyan Ganu, who we've already talked about today, was killed. He was especially famous for being persecuted. They persecuted Russians. And despite all of this, children are still being brought up in Russian. They're still speaking Russian. And they're not trying to renounce their roots, their history, nor their true values. So now Rada is trying to deal with them. Because according to the authors, this poses a serious threat to the state of Ukraine. Not Zelensky, who came up with this horrifying, violent mobilization of Ukraine. He's not a threat, but it's Russian language that is a threat. What kind of state is it if their security is threatened by children speaking their own maternal language? If you're so bothered by monuments, by the names of cities, by the names of streets, or a language spoken by those around you, it seems you're building your state on a foreign territory, and this fully applies to the Kiev regime, because authorities who leave through Western grants and who try to destroy their own citizens and who try to prohibit them from speaking their own language, who prohibit them from praying in their own church or honoring the memory of their ancestors, of their own families, cannot be called anything other than occupants.
Tomorrow, the press conference will take place in the Russia Сегодня press center. It is devoted to the crimes of neo-Nazis. It will be attended by Maxim Grigoriev, the author of the report, the Tatiana Moskalikova, and Rodan Miroshnik, ambassador at large of the Russian MFA. This report is based on testimonies of 80 Russian soldiers who came back to Russia. They are talking about torture and abuse. They are qualified as military crimes and has no statute of limitations. The tribunal demands the punishment to the fullest extent of the law. All the information will be available at the website of the organization, of the organizers. A very relevant topic. We talked about it many times, and we continue talking about it, about the involvement of the Western special services in actions against our country. Our country is considered as a main threat to the security, and they openly want to strategically deter Russia. We can say that since the beginning of the special military operation, it was a large-scale anti-Russian campaign with the use of information and communication technologies for military and political purposes. Ukraine became a base of a number of operations against Russia in cyberspace. In Kiev, Lvov, there's units of special services and military agencies from NATO countries. They coordinate actions of the Zelensky regime in digital space. The alliance actively reformed the Ukrainian cyber forces through a specialized fund, NATO Trust Fund Ukraine. Since 2022, the Biden administration sent employees from Pentagon to Ukraine in charge of cyber command, as well as their colleagues from NSA in charge of management in computer networks. They also organized computer attacks against Russian resources. These actions is hidden behind the so-called volunteer IT army of Ukraine. According to the information available, this group includes more than 130 hacker groups. This group includes employees of the main Directorate of Intelligence of the Ukrainian Armed Forces in the Department of Computer and Information Security of SBU. But the West even encouraged such actions. At the European Forum on Cybersecurity in Katowice, IT army, the Vice Prime Minister of Ukraine, Mikhail Fedorov, personally, he was given an award. You know what for? Direct quote, to counter Russian aggression. You know what we're talking about? We're talking about cybercrime. To implement these aims, the Zelensky regime uses more than thousands of fraudulent call centers that exist in the country. A lot of them focus in the city of Dnieper, in the city, but anything can happen. More than 100,000 people is involved in this sphere. The infrastructure of such facilities are in the Netherlands and Germany. 92% of the calls come from the territory of Ukraine aimed against Russian citizens and our agencies. There is no people in our country who didn't receive such calls. On the behest of the Biden administration, transnational IT corporations gave the Zelensky regime with digital resources for this. We know that the Google tools are used for geospatial and technical reconnaissance in Russia and in the zone of the special military operation to monitor our information space and communication channels. They also give cloud technologies to the Ukrainian side for cyber attacks. Some Israeli technological companies also interact with the IT army of Ukraine. The Western companies, and we'll give you the list of these companies in the text of the briefing, ignore the fact that these technologies are used for harmful and even extremist actions. The Internal Ministry of Russia started a series of criminal cases on fraud against citizens of the Russian Federation worth billions of rubles. IP addresses of these call centers were established. They are registered on the territory of Ukraine, and the personalities of perpetrators also were established. The Western officials and ostensibly independent media, as well as experts in information security, based on the data of the highly likely type, say about large-scale Russian aggression as the cyber war started by Russia, and at the same time, on the order of Washington, they ignore public statements of Ukrainian officials about organization of computer attacks against our country. That's how the rules-based world order promoted by the US works. This approach gives the US an opportunity to do anything in the information space that they wish to, and to define who's guilty and to take action against them. At the same time, crimes against the geopolitical opponents of the US are ignored or even encouraged. Germany. On March the 18th is a special date because the Bundestag made a decision to eliminate the restrictions that used to exist for loans and multi-billion expenditures to arm the German armed forces. It essentially means that they transition to the forced militarization. Doesn't it remind you of anything? I think it does. The haste and lack of principles testify to the rampant anti-Russian policy of Germany. There's one more reason. It is an economic collapse. A total collapse of the policy of Germany in terms of the implementation of those aims that were put forward for many years to come in economy, finance, industry, trade, in production. Why? Because there's no resources. It used to exist before Berlin refused Russian energy resources on the behest of the US. Lack of resources does not let them work at the rate they can. But this collapse does not give them any opportunity but to go back to what was time-tested. But they forget what everything led to. It led to the collapse of the country. That happened many times, but to rewrite history is something that affects their understanding of the situation. There would be Chancellor Friedrich Merz during debate in Bundestag started an ungrounded rant about Russia ostensibly starting a war against Europe. But I would like to ask him, in what part of the Western Europe our country is fighting? We'll know that. He talked about the supposed Russian attacks on industry and energy facilities of the European countries. Did you complete the investigation in Berlin in terms of who exploded Northern Streams 1 and 2? But you did not. So stop making up things and talking about things that you have no idea about. He went even further and called to prepare for confrontation with our country, I quote, in the nearest years and decades, end of quote. But Russia is not going to attack Germany. If Germany says such things, it means that Germany has such plans. So Berlin has to call a spade a spade. We cannot but remember a well-known idea about that the German political elites strives for historic revenge, and once in a century they prevail over common sense and even life instincts. Hot brains in Berlin and other European capitals should be aware that Russia will respond in a timely and tough manner to any militarist aspirations to prevent threats against our security. But they have an opportunity to people in Germany to ask their government what kind of adventure they're trying to involve the European continent in. 100 years ago, they were provoked, and they back then were indeed provoked to do so, and people know that. Probably they revisit their stance. March the 21st marks 11 years. If we since the political part of the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement was signed in Brussels, it had positive ideas about respect of human rights, rule of law, political dialogue, reforms, justice, freedom, security, about and all of this, if it had been followed, it should have led Ukraine to a democratic European family, or as Josep Borrell said, to a garden. The EU can be called anything but a garden today. According to a number of European politicians, it is getting more and more a zone of impunity, lack of rights and freedom. Any ideas about convergence of Ukraine and EU based on neoliberal values are very cynic, but they reflect the true treatment of the EU towards the Kiev regime and the institution of human rights. Under the association agreement, the human rights, democratic principles and fundamental freedoms was to, I quote, the basis of internal and foreign policy of both sides. But what side respects human rights? The Ukrainian side or the European Union? A goal of the political dialogue and the document was, I quote, to strengthen the respect of democratic principles, the rule of law, due management, human rights and fundamental rights, including rights of those from national minorities, end of quote. It was infringed in the document that was signed on March 21st, 11 years ago. Can you please tell me, any of these things enumerated is respected in Ukraine? We just talked about the situation with the Russian language there. They wash out the Russian language in various ways. They even enshrine in laws the inability for children to talk Russian in between the lessons. And 11 years ago, they pledged allegiance to the EU and to the rights of national minorities. What can a country that is in political, social, humanitarian, economic death pains from the European countries that are in deep crisis of identity? Let us remember the former European Commissioner of Justice, and his lottery ticket was hundreds of thousands of euros, about suitcases full of money, and of certain European deputies and their property in the Mediterranean Sea, about lobbyists in European institutions. Because of them, Brussels makes unpopular political decisions. They procured anti-COVID vaccines on the disadvantageous conditions for the EU through tax that what Ursula von der Leyen did. All of this is the talk of the town. A weakness and dependence of judicial power. This is evidenced by the investigation of deals about vaccines in the EU. As to the national minorities in the EU, look what's going on in the Baltic states. Regarding this, according to the international experts, the Russian-speaking population doesn't have the right to have rights there, end of quote. We also see growing Islamophobia, anti-Semitism in the European Union. Probably that's what Ukraine can learn from the EU. The EU also suppress all kinds of dissent. They ban media, control journalists, the information space, cancel results of the elections. They select those who can go to the next round, not through electoral procedures, but by political orders. For example, something like that happened in Romania. What they do with the historic memory is one of the root causes of all these problems that I mentioned. They wash away and doesn't mention the deeds of the Red Army who liberated prisoners from concentration camps. This is an example of quasi-values of the EU, and Ukraine follows this policy outlined by the EU. In this case, it is relevant as ever to talk about the convergence between the EU and Ukraine. They continue to ignore the violence demonstrated by the Kiev regime. They commit crimes against humanity and forget about the humanitarian law. They discriminate on the national principle, and they destroy freedom of speech. The information about this is included in reports of the MFA of Russia and joint reports of MFAs of Russia and Belarus on the situation with human rights in certain countries in the world, the illegal actions by the Kiev regime targeting the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and others. All these documents are available on the internet websites of MFA, including in the English language. One more topic concerning Ukraine history. March 27th, 26th. An international conference is organized, dedicated to the 80th conference of Yalta conference. It will be hosted by the Livadia Palace in Yalta. It will be attended by more than 100 statesmen, politicians, historians, people from Great Britain, China, the US, France is going to come. The director of the Earth Institute of the Columbia University, Jeffrey Sachs, is going to attend, and many other public figures. Participants of the Congress will talk about relevant geopolitical challenges in the era of global changes. It is especially relevant to talk about dialogue and cooperation between the leading world powers and Russia's role in the shaping of a new world order.
Крыма в Россию дали мощный импульс пересмотру.
There was a strong impetus given to the old system of the global governance. Now new centers are gaining strength that are for equality, sovereignty of peoples and countries. In the current geopolitical situation, current event is a unique opportunity, taking into account the basis of the conference of 1945, to analyze the prospects of new world order. And of course, we invite the media representatives of Russian and foreign ones to cover this event. We also have covered Yemen situation. You know that the U.S. president declared a large-scale operation against the Ansar Allah to make them go to the cessation of attacks because they undermine the security of international navigation in the Red Sea. In the last couple of days, Americans have launched missiles and bombs at Sana'a, Sada, Marib, El Beta, Damar, Haja. They target both military and civilian infrastructure. According to the information of medical services, as of March 18th, the number of casualties exceeded 50 people, more than 100 were injured. The Houthis tried to attack the vessels, the ships from the strike force of the U.S. Our evaluations were given in this statement, and the results of the telephone call between Sergei Lavrov and Marco Rubio that took place on March 15th, the Russian side has emphasized the necessity to go to the cessation of the hostilities and also to establish political dialogue to not go to the cessation of the hostilities and also to establish political dialogue to not permit the escalation. We call upon the parties of the conflict to refuse the strong arm tactics, and we need normalization in Yemen only through diplomacy and political means. All responsible members of the international community should use joint efforts to help the Yemeni under the aegis of the UN to launch the process of complex political settlements on the basis of Saudi Arabia and the Sultanate of Oman agreements in the roadmap. 35th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic ties between the Russian Federation and the Republic of Namibia. It's symbolic that this is a symbolic and remarkable date, that it coincides with the 35th anniversary of the independence of Namibia. We see clear evidence of this of the stability, the strength of the ties and friendship, solidarity, and mutual support between our countries. In 1990s, this day became the climax of the heroic fight of the Namibian people who didn't want to put up with the yoke of colonialism and apartheid and defended its self-determination. A large impetus to create its own state was the Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples that was adopted by General Assembly in 1960, the initiative of the USSR. Moscow became one of the first countries to extend a helping hand to Namibians under the leadership of the Southwest Africa People's Organization. In 1960s, 1980s, the Soviet Union gave the Southwest Africa People's Organization military, financial, information, and organizational support. In 1987, Moscow opened the representative office of the Southwest Africa People's Organizations, which helped Namibia to go through the hardest years of gaining independence, the establishment, and of informing of the statehood. This party is still very strong, a strong political power in the country. We saw it in the national elections in November last year, and the Southwest Africa People's Organization won a landslide victory, and Madam Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah was candidate in the presidency. After 1990s, our relations with Namibia have further strengthened, and they continue to become even more multifaceted. We have strengthen our constructive and trustful political and diplomatic dialogue. We have reached a high level of cooperation in the UN and other international platforms. We have collected a significant experience of a mutually beneficial business cooperation in different areas. It has been also large contribution was also received from the Intergovernmental Russian-Namibian Commission on Trade and Economic Cooperation, and one of the co-chairs was Madam Nandi-Ndaitwah, who is going to enter the office of the head of state. We confirm our unwavering commitment to joint work to step up the whole complex of bilateral cooperation for the benefit of the peoples of Russia and Namibia. We're interested in continuing the deepened exchange of opinions on the most important international problems, and we are ready to closely cooperate. Our efforts We are hopeful that Moscow and Windhoek will cooperate on the international arena and will facilitate the establishment and forming of the democratic and secure world order, and to unblock crisis situation in the African continent. One other historical day that refers us to another historical day that used to be pretty was only commercial, but it had a very significant geopolitical dimension, which in turn influenced the results of the Second World War. We're talking about the 90th anniversary of the selling of the Chinese Eastern Railway by the USSR. It was sold by a Manchukuo state. We have to talk about military and political dimensions. The militarist Japan in 1931 began an open aggression against China and in fact created in the northeastern part of its territory a puppet government that was called Manchukuo. This puppet government was under the Japan's unchallenged reign. What was the plan of the military clique of Japan? They wanted to take Siberia and the Soviet Far East, Tokyo. Against this backdrop, started to implement the strategy aimed at the economic suffocation of borderlands of Far East territories of our country. The main military and logistics artery that provided adjacent districts of China was the Chinese Eastern Railway. It was built by the Russian Empire in 1903 and was owned by the USSR. There were regular acts of sabotage and provocation, and the Japanese took part in those acts. A recently released feature film of the Russian, made both by Russian and Chinese, which is called Red Silk, demonstrates how that all occurred. We also have published memoirs of foreign scouts. The situation around the Chinese Eastern Railway in the 1930s was so critical that further actions to protect that road could have turned out to be very, very dramatic for our country. Tokyo wanted to provoke such a confrontations, and we have proof in the archive of foreign policy of the Russian Federation. They also testify about the high art of domestic diplomacy. Russian diplomats, Soviet diplomats knew the genuine intentions of Japanese partners who hid behind the backs of the so-called independent Manchuria representatives. Our country demonstrated a massive stamina and persuasiveness and unique creativity in the settling of the problem. There were very tense negotiations, and a final document was signed to sell the railroad. It was a good break for the Soviet Union. They gave it an opportunity to prepare for the defense of the eastern frontiers. Thanks to this timely step, in the 1938-1939, Japan's actions during the Battle of Lake Hassan and the Battle of Gol weren't that successful. Among those servicemen was my grandfather, and Soviet, well, let me digress. That's the 80th anniversary is approaching, so I hope you permit me this digression. The archive materials unambiguously demonstrate inadmissible, wild, barbaric methods of Japanese emissaries in Manchuria. They perpetrated atrocities against Soviet citizens, the staff of the railroad, and those who felt sympathy, immigrants that felt sympathy with our country. We're talking about tortures and killings. By the way, we are now preparing a special selection of declassified materials on this narrative, and shortly we are going to publish it on the Foreign Ministry website. These documents are going to include documents which directly refer to that period and are associated with the modern times. You can see the parallels there. You're going to see the attempts of Japan, together with the Polish government of that time, to financially and otherwise support the nationalist Ukrainian movement to organize an uprising in the western part of the Soviet Union to destabilize the domestic situation in case Moscow were to declare massive draft. And the eve of the 80th anniversary of the great victory and the surrender of the militaries, Japan were going to continue the work to discover historical truth and to counter the attempts of some countries to falsify the key events of the past, to warp the root causes and the results of the Second World War. The part of the global community who's still humane remains the bombings of Yugoslavia. The U.S. and their satellites trampled underfoot the basics of security in Europe, and this crisis is not overcome yet. About these horrible events of 1999, we still remember a lot. The chronology of this intrusion is being recorded minute by minute very meticulously, but it doesn't mean that over time those massacres fade in our memory or lose their symbolism. The NATO allies call upon forgetting the past, to turn the page. Yet the Serbian people remember that bloody spring. The so-called humanitarian intervention committed by NATO is a example of this rules-based order. It's an example of what is inside this rules-based order, this unfounded belief in their own right. The propaganda was hard at work to make the Serbs to feel makes the Serbs feel guilty, so that they would consider it a learned lesson, those bombings of Yugoslavia. With munitions with depleted uranium caused cancer in a lot of people, but they were saying that they carry the values of freedom and democracy to the Balkans. Even Italian servicemen who were among the NATO troops and were in that area still cannot bring those to justice because they cannot compensate their medical costs. That's what Western democracy is about. You know what I still call the 100 peaceful citizens of Yugoslavia, including 89 kids, they call it collateral damage. That's what democracy is and freedom of speech. One can refer to the results of last year poll with regard to the aggression in today's Serbia. The work called The Long Echo of 1990. More than 75% of respondents think that Washington and Brussels have not atoned for what they did to Serbs, but they're not going to do that. They just wait. They're just waiting for a moment to do what they couldn't do then, to break Serbia, and we're doing everything we can to not let it happen. We see that the Serbian society is unified as far as the motivation of NATO is concerned, to use the military campaign to secede Kosovo and turn it into a Western colony. The West gave terrorists from the Kosovo Liberation Army arms. It gave it a pseudo state status, and from behind the scenes it encourages ethnic cleansing against the core Serb population, NATO is not going to wash away the shame of its war crimes, including the destruction of residential districts, hospitals, schools, bridges, passenger transportation, refugee convoys. It's very similar to what we see now. We will stand in solidarity with our brothers Serbs to preserve the memory of those victims of the tragedy of 1999, and will prevent the attempts to rewrite the history of the Yugoslavian crisis using Western models. We will also be on guard of the historical memory. Another piece of news: the Vizov, which means challenge prize for future technologies, they are going to accept applications till May 21st. That's the second time the international nomination Discovery is going to be awarded to foreign and Russian scientists who live in Russia or abroad for an important discovery that impacted the development of global science and technology. Scientists, mathematicians, physicians, chemists, those who work in biomedicine, astronomy, and engineering can qualify for the award. The prize fund in the current year is going to be 60 million rubles, 12 million rubles for each of the 5 nominations. Last year, 100 applications were accepted from 34 countries of the world in this Discovery nomination. The mission of this prize is very well known, but I'm going to repeat it. It's the striving to form among the representatives of the younger generation the desire to connect their life with the science. Of course, we encourage the attempts of the Visa Foundation, that is the author of this initiative, to develop the scientific diplomacy for the benefit of the world peaceful process. Russia has always been in favor of strengthening equal and mutually beneficial international dialogue in terms of science, which is still a great tool for responding to current global challenges and serves as a basis of the whole humanity. We are inviting talented, ambitious scientists from all over the world to take part in this competition. And we hope that the prize will be awarded to those who deserve it most. The detailed information can be found on the official website, and the link will be available in the text version of this briefing. Do we have International Life with us? Madam